Passed a state trooper. Didn't want to be recording a video while I was driving past a cop. Oops. Source book on Clan Brujah I read, and it divided Brujah into 3 different types: iconoclasts, idealists, and individualists. Iconoclasts just want to tear down everything. Idealists are folks, are old school vampires, usually like millennia old or sired by millennia old traditionalist Brujah who wanted to build the perfect society. And that goes back to the fall of Carthage and stuff like that. And then there's the individualist who has just decided, just wants to be left alone. I do my thing, you do your thing. And in reading that, which I think was in the second phase of Morrigan's career, I decided he was an individualist because iconoclast didn't make sense for him, and he wasn't old enough to be an idealist. So individualist, I connected with that philosophy. In Kevin's group, we ran a story where Morrigan was turned human again. And as my career in vampire role-playing goes on, I actually end up generally rejecting the turned human again storylines that I've encountered. But we played it then. It was a tabletop group. Doesn't affect anybody beyond ourselves. That'll make sense as we go on. And to be sired again, because Kevin didn't want to. 8th is as old as as powerful as a vampire can get, and Kevin wanted to transcend that generational limit without having Morrigan, and Morrigan I wouldn't have assassinate another vampire by draining their soul, which is the only way to make an 8th generation vampire into a 7th generation vampire. Has to eat a vampire's soul that's of lower generation than he is. So I wouldn't do it. So to get Morrigan down to 7th generation, Kevin turned him human and then had him re-sired by a 6th generation vampire. And in that story, that 6th generation vampire was Wyatt Earp. There were some NPCs, non-player characters, that became a part of that campaign. Top Hat and Sylvia. Top Hat was a Nosferatu in the service of Justicar Petrodon, who was a top law enforcement agent of the Camarilla, to make sure that the traditions get enforced. Sylvia was a Gangrel, shape-shifting, animal-loving vampire in the service of Justicar Petrodon. And Mark was a Toreador who was sired and abandoned. And Petrodon was going to destroy him, but we ended up taking him in to our cell. Let's see. My concentration's thrown. Still watching that truck back there. I don't remember much about the storyline itself, honestly. It's where we wove in Petrodon, and Morrigan eventually became an Archon, which is like a field agent in service of the Justicar. So the Justicar is one guy, and he can send out a bunch of Archons to a bunch of different places. And yeah, I'm going to leave that one there. It's where I created Morrigan. I really liked the character. I really detailed out a lot of his psychology and his background and who he was. I understood the character. So I'll put that one on hold, and we'll come back to that in a future video. The next one I want to talk about is the Assamite game. Remember when I said a few minutes ago that Morrigan couldn't get more powerful because he was unwilling to drain the soul of an older vampire to make him effectively lower his generation. Well, we wanted to explore that idea. So one of the lesser clans, there's 7 that make up the Camarilla. There's two that rejected the Camarilla and formed a group called the Sabbat. And the Sabbat is dedicated to the idea that vampires are the top of the food chain, and therefore have nothing to fear from humans and should live in domination of them. And I don't like Sabbat games. I find them abusive. And we'll get back to that when we talk about the second half of Morrigan's career. And then there are several other clans that are independent. They're not part of either the Camarilla or the Sabbat for whatever reason. One of those independent clans is the Assamites, and they are assassins. Yeah, we get into the political correctness of it because it's the early 90s. But the Assamites have a taste for draining older. It's called diablerie or diablerizing, and they have a taste for it. So they had a blood curse placed on them as a clan so that they could no longer drink the blood of other vampires. And this is before we had seen the Sabbat source books. They hadn't come out yet because they were trying to avoid publishing them, it looked like. So pre that idea, we came up with, Kevin made a character that was an Assamite that was not subject to the blood curse. He'd broken it. And so we wanted to have him diablerize his way down the generations and see how long we could make stories for it that made sense. Because once you get to fourth generation, a fourth generation vampire is called a Methuselah, and they're written in the game as you don't need game mechanic statistics for this character. It's too powerful for the players to handle unless you want them to be able to. So we wrote stories down to, Kevin got his way down to third generation. And the third generation, the first vampire according to the World of Darkness was Cain, as in Cain and Abel, son of Adam and Eve. And as part of his curse, he became a vampire. He was cursed by the archangels, and that's how he became the first vampire. Then he sired, I think it was 3 children that founded the city of Enoch. And then the 3 children, sometimes it's 5. I don't remember. It's been a long time since I brushed up on this stuff. They sired the 13 of the third generation that became the major clans and bloodlines of today. And the 13 rose up. The 13 are known as the antediluvians because they existed before the flood, and they slaughtered the second generation. So supposedly there are no second generation vampires, and Cain may or may not be out there. Kevin located the Brujah antediluvian. Well, kind of. In the Brujah backstory, there's a character named Troile, and Troile has a clan discipline called Temporis, which, as it sounds, lets Troile affect the flow of time. Well, Troile had a child, and that was Brujah, or sired a child with an E, as a young vampire. And Brujah rose up and killed Troile, but did not get Temporis. Brujah instead got a discipline called Celerity, which is super speed. So it was a variation on Temporis, but not full-time control. So the story that we wrote was that Troile, to avoid being completely destroyed by Brujah, had locked herself into a pocket dimension of time where she had been reliving the same night for over 6,000 years, never having found a way to get out. So once Kevin's character found his way into that pocket dimension of time, Troile was willing to die and gave up her existence willingly to Kevin's Assamite character. So Kevin diablerized a third generation vampire. That was where we stopped playing, because I don't believe I ever came up with a story for the second generation vampire, and we never got to the confrontation with Kane. But we would have had we continued playing. There's one other story I want to throw in from that game. I've always been fond of... Kevin and I had arguments over Mage. This game Mage, essentially, you're a character that can affect reality, but reality will backlash against you in the form of paradox if you don't have a way to explain it as a coincidence. So the more a person observing your magical effect will go, what the hell? That can't happen. The worse the paradox is going to be for your character. So I argued that you could create a lightning strike out of an electrical outlet or an electrical fixture given the right conditions. And Kevin went, no, you can't do that. And that caused us some... Because, if you can't create coincidental magic, I would have taken a little bit of paradox for it. Because, yeah, it's stretching the bounds of reality. But it's not a flat-out, no, you can't do that. So that led to an issue. But Mage's bad guys, or antagonists, I should say, since they won the Ascension War, are a group called the Technocracy, who advance magic through technology. And there are 5 different groups that make up the Technocracy. And so the Technocracy was spying on Kevin's character, the Asimite, because they wanted to help destroy vampires, which is probably where I was going to go with the second generation and or Kane. They would have helped him find and maybe even fight those characters. And so Kevin was carrying, all the characters were carrying cell phones, early generation cell phones, when they realized the Technocracy was tracking them through their cell phones. And Kevin went, what? And he didn't believe that was likely or possible. And the characters destroyed all their cell phones at that point, so they couldn't be directly tracked by the Technocracy. I've always been amused by that story, because it was like 1992, 93, and well before GPS coordination. And nowadays I would just go, yeah, of course they track you by your cell phone. That's one of the things cell phones do. The final story I want to include from this game, and if others come back to me, I'll list them in the future. We had a fantasy game in the world of Warhammer. Oh, I remember a Middle-earth role-playing game, too. I created a Bjorn, but we didn't play enough of that. We did a Warhammer fantasy role-playing game. You may be familiar with Warhammer 40K, which is the sci-fi miniatures version. So Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was their attempt at a tabletop in the fantasy genre. I created a character named Farrell Shadrach, who was an elf charlatan. He couldn't read at the outset, and I just have an affinity for playing Han Solo type characters, so Farrell was one of those. And eventually our characters became the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and Farrell was Pestilence. I don't remember the rationale, but our fighter character in the group was Mickey. He was War. Jared and Dustin were Famine and Death, but I don't remember which is which. And it was like the Bible, but through a different lens. Like an examination of how stories can get telephoned or twisted or changed over time. And so we realized we were playing characters that would become different things as represented in the Bible. And it was a fun campaign. Warhammer is based on a profession system, and so you graduate from profession to profession throughout the course of your character's life. So he started as a charlatan, became a gambler. I might have that backwards. From there, he became a spy. From that, he became a witch hunter, and then an assassin. And I might have messed up that lineage. I haven't looked at that character in a long time. but eventually he became an assassin, became Pestilence, and I was like, why wouldn't he be Death? And it made more sense to Kevin that somebody else be Death. And I don't think the labels mattered that much anyway. So that was a fun campaign that I remember from that era. That's about it. That's all I want to talk about for Chill. My origins in the World of Darkness, the game with Kevin and Mickey and Dustin and Jared and Bianca. And that table. That's the early 90s. Peace.